In number and richness of detail, written sources on Rome surpass by far our dossiers of other ancient states. But as regards the first half a millennium of her existence, the historian is obliged to face the obstacle classically formulated almost 300 years ago by Louis de Beaufort in his dissertation on the uncertainty of the first 5 centuries of Roman history. Rome was traditionally founded around 750 BC. The kings were overthrown around 500, but the earliest Roman historians wrote at the end of the 3rd century, 500 years after the birth of the city and 300 years after the beginning of the Republic. How then could authentic information have been preserved for so long before it found its way into the literary tradition? The other major obstacle is that the said tradition is not uniform, but exists in a number of variants. How then can we decide which of them might be imparting genuine knowledge? In the modern historiography, the term early Rome usually carries this notion of uncertainty, with the result that the chronological limits, more precisely its ending, differs from one scholarly work to another, since it reflects the author's views on starting from which point our evidence becomes sufficiently reliable to enable us to reconstruct Rome's history. Optimists limit so understood early Rome to the monarchical period, for, with the coming of the Republic, traditional date 509, the kings were replaced by early magistrates, consuls, whose names indicated years. For example, what we denote as 59 BC was for the Romans the year when Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus and Gaius Julius Caesar were consuls. This eponymic system of dating provided a secure chronological frame to which information on events which took place in a given year could be attached. Pessimists retort that the eponymic system is not reliable until the middle of the 4th century, and anyway, because of distortions and contradictions of the Roman tradition, the truly historical phase of the Republic starts only when you can check information it contains with Greek sources. And this extends early Rome to the beginning or even to the end of the 3rd century, that is the time of the first historians. Needless to say, so radical an attitude is sheer madness. So, more seriously minded skeptics look for a moment when, from the Roman history, as narrated by our sources, disappear obviously unreal events, physically impossible, mythological, taken from the Greek tradition, etc. Now, the last period when we find such events is the first decade of the 4th century, when Rome was engaged in a war to the death with her Etruscan neighbor, Veii. The most blatantly fictitious of the supernatural events related in narratives of that war, and the skeptics' strongest argument that we are still in the face of, to borrow the quoted phrase of Louis de Beaufort, uncertainty of Roman history, appears an event reported under the year 398 in the most detailed description by a historian writing 400 years later, reads as follows. A certain lake, distant not less than 120 states, 20 kilometers from Rome, in the Alban Mountains, as they are called, beside which in ancient times the mother city of the Romans was situated, at a time when neither rains nor snowstorms had occurred, nor any other cause perceptible to human beings, received such an increase to its waters that it inundated a large part of the region lying round the mountains, destroyed many farmhouses, and finally carved out the gap between the mountains and poured a mighty river down over the plains lying below. Now, the Alban Lake is the bigger and deeper of the two still existing crater lakes within the caldera of an enormous volcano looming on Rome's southern horizon, known as Colli Albani, Alban Hills, whose ashes, magma, and pumices created between 600,000 and 300,000 years ago most of the historical Latium, including Rome's seven hills. The miraculous rise of its waters was seen by the Romans as a particularly ominous prodigy, so grave that, the tradition relates, they sent a delegation to the Delphic oracle to inquire about its meaning. The erudites of the 17th and 18th century of our era, convinced of the historicity of practically everything they read in ancient sources, put forward various explanations of the tradition, but the rationalist 19th and 20th centuries firmly delegated it to the limbo of fantasies. As succinctly put by Georges Dumézil, the author of the most widely accepted exegesis, we are dealing, I quote, with a phenomenon about which we know for sure that it could never have taken place, unquote. Now, in 1999, I was a member of the jury for the public defense of the habilitation dissertation of a French classicist, Alexandre Grandazzi, which came out 9 years later under the title Alba Longa, History of a Legend, a huge work in 2 volumes, the first all-comprehensive study not just of Alba Longa, the mythical metropolis of Rome, but of the Colli Albani, the cradle of the Latin ethnos, and so of the Romans as well, and absolutely everything in it, including its water, starting with the Alban Lake. Now, during the proceedings, we are still in 1999, the main criticism of my colleagues was directed against Grandazzi's acceptance of the historicity of the miraculous rise of the lake and of its rational explanation as the result of a natural eruption of carbon dioxide dissolved in the lake's water. He found in geological reports in the state archives in Rome that the Alban Lake is the most charged with this substance in the world after 2 lakes in Cameroon, Monon and, here shown, Neos. And for the same reason, all these lakes fill craters of now essentially dormant volcanoes directly above warm magmatic chambers in which rock is still liquid. From these chambers, volcanic gases seep upwards through fissures in rock and accumulate at the bottoms of the lakes. Afterwards, things go exactly as when we open the bottle of champagne, or for that matter, a can of beer. Something, local earthquake, minor eruption of compressed gas down in the magma, triggers an explosion of carbon dioxide dissolved in the liquid with, in the case of champagne, bubbles bursting from the bottle. But in our lakes, release of clouds of deadly gas and eruption of water mixed with volcanic mud, which sometimes overflows the rim of the crater and floods the surrounding areas. In support of the hypothesis that this was what happened in 398, Grandazzi quoted the case of the said Cameroonian lakes which erupted in this manner in respectively 1984, Monon, and 1986, Neos. The tragic results of the latter eruption, which killed 1,746 people and 3,500 cattle, plus innumerable wild animals from insects to elephants, suffocated by carbon dioxide, led to a worldwide research on the phenomenon which, needless to say, did not reach the classicist ears, save for one pair of ears, those of Alexandre Grandesi. Now, what he presented in 1999 was a hypothesis, suggestive to be sure, backed by a solid scientific material, but still a hypothesis, as he admitted himself. Another quotation. Of course, we shall never know for sure what exactly happened in 398, unquote. Only adding that the possibility that it was a natural phenomenon, in other words, that it belongs to the domain of history, not mythology, is very strong. Well, this admission has, in the meantime, been proved wrong, in that today we do know, I repeat, do know what happened in 398. In the last decade of the 20th century, the Italian geologists found traces of two great eruptions following the outlined above scenario in the Bronze Age, one about 5,000 and the other 3,000 years ago, which, among others, through an overflow of volcanic mud consisting of pyroclastic material and organic sediments from the bottom of the lake, created the flat plain of Ciampino in the southeastern suburb of today's Rome. This finding already made the natural explanation of the Alban miracle of 398 almost certain, but the best was still to come. In 2006, the archaeologists investigating the valley of Torre Spaccata in Rome, some 15 kilometers from the lake and 5 kilometers from the city center, uncovered there a strip of volcanic mud of Alban provenance, its still now further documented occurrence in the northwestern direction. Here you see its characteristic texture. The uppermost, that is the most recent layer of which, can be dated very precisely by pottery sherds carried by the mud flow of the type in use in the 5th and 4th century, and by a burial of a woman dug in that layer, dated by radiocarbon between 410 and 190 BC. The miracle of the Alban Lake in 398 has on this evidence been first corroborated and second explained. So, how far can we trust our sources on early Rome? It goes without saying that the demonstration that the tradition on the rise of the lake during the last war with Veii describes accurately what happened then opens new perspectives on the reliability of the extant narratives. But I would like to close my short exposition on a slightly different note. During the defense of the dissertation, Grandesi, bombarded by the members of the jury, unimpressed by his argumentation, chiefly because unable to abandon, all of a sudden, an idea which for decades they held for an unshakable truth, literally closed their mouth with the following ace, till then held up his sleeve. He told us that when he wrote to the leading French volcanological periodical asking for a comment on the enclosed chemical content of the Alban Lake's water without disclosing the lake's name, the answer was that he should warn the local authorities of the necessity to immediately evacuate all the inhabitants within the radius of 25 kilometers from the lake.